Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to the month in review video for October. My goodness, it's been another month. Maybe I need to switch to the quarterly review because these months are going by awful fast. Anyways, side note. So it hasn't been quite as busy a month as September was, but there's still some important stuff happening. So let's jump into it, starting with our honorable mentions from the monthly painting competition. First, we have David D, who's painting this monstrosity from the Soul Snatchers. That light bone color for the carapace contrasts really nicely with the bright red skin. And while pink and red usually clash, I actually think it works well here. Then you have that green smoke coming from the weapon as another really stark contrast that adds an accent that I think makes it look really, really nice. So if David has an entire army painted in this scheme, I would really like to see it. The next honorable mention in the solo category goes to Foxblood75, who didn't just paint a mini, but created an action diorama. And on top of that, the paint job is incredibly clean. The jewels in the chest armor are fantastic, and the job on the face is absolutely spectacular. The eyes, the mouth, the teeth, the eyebrows, everything is given attention, and it looks spectacular. So awesome job there, Foxblood. For the third, I wanted to actually give a group mention for this one to everybody who painted the Vampire Rogue from OnePageRules Fantasy Quest. There were some amazing submissions here. Big Maiku here does a nice job contrasting the dark purple with the pink trim, and then the white skin and the red hair, giving you this really, really nice contrast between dark and light. And the colorful tufts on the base help to add and bring out those little bits of color and accent for a model that otherwise is supposed to look very, very dark and shadowy. Now I'm going to butcher this name right here. Dates? Sorry, dude. Also does an incredible job on their model using non-metallic metal on the dagger and giving the cloth a satin or a velvet appearance by having it blend so nicely from the bright red to the black. Ghislain here has a really clever twist. Now, I may be wrong, but I think the motivation here is Little Red Riding Hood, with, of course, a bit of a twist. Any wolf that tries to trick her is in for a very big surprise. Moriartis here goes even further with that bright red color scheme. I don't think he's going for Little Red Riding Hood, but still does an outstanding job on the gold trim and the metal on the dagger, again using that non-metallic metal. So my hat's off to any folks who can paint like that because it looks fantastic. And Von Hymak here has a really neat scheme on the cloak, blending from blue to green. I was a big fan of the Alpha Legion paint scheme back in 40K of that kind of aqua teal blending from blue into green, and they've managed to achieve it here really awesome. It looks like the cloak could almost shimmer and change color as the character moves around. So the only comment that I have left about some of these entries is, why are so many of the vampires painted as redheads? Now, we all know that vampires are damned and don't have a soul, but did you have to go and make it all personal like that? Anyways, moving on to the unit category, there were only 6 entries. And so after awarding first through third, and then the random entry, there's only 2 entries left. So let's take a look at both of them. First is Vexinx. Again, I apologize for butchering people's names. First is this one, that painted up a unit of swarms. The dark gray carapace looks really good with that bright purple fleshy bits. And every single tooth has been individually painted as well. That's a lot of tiny details. So kudos to Vex for doing it. Moving on, we have Zalia, who has chosen a very bright, contrasting paint scheme. It's a solid foundation, and once you start adding some shading and highlighting, I think these things can look fantastic. Now we have a similar situation with the army entries. There were only 6. First through third get a showing, and then a random one does. So there's only 2 left. Let's take a look at those remaining 2. Guzzoid's army has more color than you could find in a pack of Skittles. It looks like each unit has a distinct color scheme, And you don't have to imagine how they'd look on the tabletop because he's got them displayed on this really nice background here. So I've noticed that more and more entries into these painting competitions are starting to add backgrounds, dioramas, and improving the way that their models are displayed. So good job on everyone who goes that extra mile. It's really paying off. Now the other army entry was from Jolyon Dodgson, and these models look super duper clean. And they've done a great job of using color without clashing. The dark blue and the yellow trim is outstanding, and the black and red heavy gunners give them a really, really menacing look. Everything looks crisp. This is definitely an army and a paint scheme to be very, very proud of. Now, surprisingly, there were no entries in the legendary category. So we'll just have to wait until next month to see what the community can do with the big models. Okay, so let's move on to the big news items. First up, OnePageRules has moved on, shall we say, from Only Games and has now opened up their own Etsy store. The minis are going to be produced through TitanForge, which is based in Poland, but gamers in the US actually won't have to pay too much in shipping. I looked on it and it looks like it's a flat $7 rate, which is pretty good given that it's coming from Eastern Europe. The model prices aren't too bad either. So it seems that OnePageRules is more than just dipping its toe in trying to expand from STLs to being more involved in producing physical minis. For example, they produced those 2-player box sets for Spiel. Now they're offering more prints through Etsy. And given that I've bought my last 2 most recent projects, the Zerg Swarm and my Fantasy Dwarves through Etsy printers, and given that I just haven't taken to 3D printing as much as I thought I would, perhaps I might have to start placing some orders. Now, what I do find interesting, though, is that TitanForge has their own line of STL files, some of which overlap with OnePageRules. Now, I know that TitanForge and OnePageRules have collaborated on models and projects. They even had a My Mini Factory Frontier project, but it does seem to me here a little bit odd because this could be a potential conflict of interest, having a competitor produce minis for your game when they produce minis of the same genre or look or style. So I hope it works out. We'll have to give it some time to see how that goes. The next big item of news is the official release of the Edge of Radiance. Now, I mistakenly included it in last month's Month in Review. I confused the launch of the campaign with the completion of it. That's my bad. So anyone who plays Alien Hives or Eternal Dynasty might want to check it out and snag the unique hero minis for those factions. And the mini wargaming battle reports for OnePageRules are also based in the Edge of Radiance campaign. So you can get to see some really professional bat reps done with OPR. Moving on, OPR is going to be releasing movement tray STLs. There are designs so that whatever kind of bases your models are on currently, OPR is going to produce a movement tray so you can convert them into square movement trays for playing regiments. Now, this isn't a really huge announcement given the number of existing STL files and producers who make conversion trays like this, but Tano said that enough folks were asking for it, so we got it. Even though Regiments is by far the I wouldn't say the least popular of all the games, but Tano was very clear in the recent live stream that Regiments is near the bottom for the number of players in a specific game from OnePageRules. But for him to then create STL files for the game that isn't that popular shows again that OnePageRules listens to its customers. So kudos to him for doing it. The next item, there was a quick update to the rules set. Now, it was more of a tweak than an update, and the focus was on correcting errors and making minor adjustments, so I'm not going to go into any details here, just to know that it's not big in comparison to the larger update that was previous. On top of that, OnePageRules confirmed that they are switching to a yearly cycle for making the really substantial changes to the rules, and I think that's a good idea. Updating every 6 months, it's a lot faster than it sounds, especially for those who don't get to play too frequently. For folks who aren't able to play weekly, they may only get to play 6 or 7 games before the rules change and they have to start all over again, and you never get a chance to get really comfortable with the rules and then play the big games that go faster because everyone knows what they're doing. So I think it's a good idea to switch to the 1 year and then to just announce, like they've done here, there's a tweak. We're adjusting a few points here or there. We're making some grammatical changes. Nothing huge. Last of all, at least in terms of news, coming in just under the wire to be included in the October review, OnePageRules has released StarQuest. For those of you who are already familiar with the Age of Fantasy quest game, it's that, but in the grimdark future. I took a very, very quick look at the rules, and they're pretty much identical, as you would expect. So if you already know how to play Age of Fantasy Quest, and you're familiar with how to use the Army Forge to play it, then you can jump right into StarQuest. As a little teaser for all of you, I am hoping within the next week or so to film a bat rep using the StarQuest rules and making use of that Helldivers army that I put the showcase video for. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully it'll be coming in December. If not, I'll try and post it earlier in January. Okay, so like I said, there's not a lot of big news items. So as usual, let's finish off the month in review by taking a look at the STL file releases for October. First up, we've got some Human Defense Force themed scatter terrain. Pieces like this are pretty much essential if you play Grimdark Future. Urban, industrial, and military bases are the go-to settings for board themes and terrain. So terrain like this is fantastic because it will fit any of those. They also look like they've been designed to give you lots of space to put models on, but avoid wobbly model syndrome, and yet still make it look like it's part of the setting. It doesn't just look like a flat plateau or something like that. On top of that, that model on the left that looks like the vat of some kind of liquid or the pit of some kind of liquid, that has a lot of possibilities too. Depending on how you paint it, it could be a slag pit, a chemical vat, a tar pit, toxic waste dump, anything simply by changing the color of that liquid. So really, really versatile terrain, essential for making at least a basic tabletop. So nice job on that one. Here we have the next Quest Hero model. And this month, it's a bard from the Duchies of Vinci. Now this model, I gotta say, it has a lot of character. From the stance and the body pose, the way it's got one foot on the stool and the other hand is on her hip, she comes across with the kind of confidence bordering on cockiness that you would expect from a professional performer or entertainer. And yet, to balance that, she's wearing that mask that suggests she has some secrets. So she wants to be public, but at the same time, she's hiding something. So that's really cool there. I'm particularly interested in that lute she's got. It has a speaker horn at the bottom and then dials like an electric guitar. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work, but I'm super excited to see what the community can do painting this model for the November painting competition by looking back and see how well everyone did with that vampire rogue. So look for some really nice entries coming up next month. Okay, moving on. We have our first look at the Human Defense Force models, and they are giving me some serious Halo vibes with those helmets. Now, the models can be printed without a face guard, but I think they look way better with it. There's a good mix of poses that you can see here. There's some crouching, some standing, some firing, some scouting. I think that's an essential element for an army that's going to require you to print lots and lots of models just to get your base troops down. If everything looks too similar, unless they're on parade and are supposed to look identical, you got to mix things up a bit, and I think these models do that. I'm also surprised at the amount of detail on them. Things like the knee pads, the canteens, the packs, the straps holding it all together. That makes them look really good, but it could also be a bit of a detriment. There aren't too many people that want to paint all those details over and over and over with a horde-based or an infantry-heavy army. So I don't know, what do you guys think? Is it too much? Or for those of you who have printed and painted some of them, is it not as bad as it looks? Moving on from the core infantry, we've got some officer models here, and overall I think they look decent. I really like the sword with the segmented blade. It looks like a cross between something you'd see in Cyberpunk 2077 and that sword that Sulu uses in the 2009 remake of Star Trek. Now, I'm not as big a fan of the axe. To me, it doesn't fit the aesthetic. The sword seems more like the weapon of a human officer. It's about finesse it's about skill, it's about technique, whereas an axe is more about brute strength. And I just don't imagine the officers in a futuristic human army are going to use an axe. It just seems like a sword will fit much, much better. I expect to see an axe in an army like the dwarves, or an army where models are physically beefier. So that's just me. Maybe the ogre units in the HDF army, they could carry axes because, as their name implies, they're supposed to be big, strong, tough models. But an individual officer with an axe, I don't know. It just doesn't fit. Could just be me. What do you guys think? Now, just like with the infantry, you can get unhelmeted versions of these officer models. You can also get a sword that doesn't have the segments, and of course there's a range of different sidearms. I think the cloak is a really nice touch because it can be painted to fit any kind of aesthetic. If you want to paint it to look like almost like an aristocratic coat of arms, it could be like a parade or a Class A type uniform, or it could be painted with camo to make it look more fitting with being out in the field. But I think that's a better way of identifying your officer model from amongst the enlisted, rather than not giving them a helmet or something like that. So I think it's a really good way of differentiating and distinguishing your officer models. Moving on from the officers, we've got the heavy weapons teams, and I'm still not totally sold on them. I mentioned in a previous video that when I saw the concept art for some of these, it made me think of two people riding a tandem bicycle, and that was a little too adorable for the grimdark future. Now, of course, heavy weapons need a loader, they need a spotter, they're weapon teams, I get that. I'm just not sold on them being attached with an umbilical cord like that. Maybe part of it is because those particular models aren't in a pose that suggests they've established a firing position. I just really have trouble imagining in the middle of combat you have two soldiers walking around this chaotic battlefield shooting this heavy weapon and not worrying about if they both have to dive for cover that they go in opposite directions. So I think if people print up these models and put some terrain or put something on the base to make it look like they've taken up a position and they're stationary, then I think it will work. Now, that aside, the weapon designs themselves look really good. I think especially that laser cannon really sells me. That thing looks scary. So nice job on that one. Moving on from the infantry, we've got our first look at some HDF vehicles. Here we've got armored personnel carriers. Now, overall, they're not bad. They're a bit too sharp and angular for my taste. The infantry have a rounded look to them, so I was expecting to see tanks and vehicles also have a more rounded look to them. I mentioned how the infantry are giving me Halo vibes. Well, I was picturing the vehicles more like the Warthog. It still looks tough, but it's not so angular. The APCs here look a little bit too boxy. Now, shifting over from the Human Defense Force over to the Age of Fantasy, we get to see the continued development of the Shadow Stalkers. Now, these Reapers here, they look very detailed, very intricate, but I still think they have a really, really good look overall. There's going to be a lot of detail and attention needed to paint them up right, but when you do, they're going to look fantastic. Those axes or halberds have a really primitive look to them that makes them look a little bit unsettling. And these swords here look especially disturbing with the way the blade is kind of wavy and it's still chipped, and then the handles or the hafts have those sensors on them. That's like a really unusual aesthetic. I think it sells it really nice, and the fact that the models are wielding them with two sets of arms and hands just adds to that whole creepy factor. So I think overall, as I've seen the Shadow Stalkers model line develop, I'm warming up to it a lot more. The champion models for these guys look even better because of their weapons. They have that really cool looking halberd, but it's that scythe that takes the cake. If you're going for shadowy, scary, disturbing, a massive scythe like something the Grim Reaper would have will always get that across. Here we've got the Stalker Fiends and the Great Fiend, the beasts of the Shadow Stalkers army. And they definitely look like something that comes from a nightmare. They're almost a cross between a dinosaur and an alien. And those tentacle claws coming off their back, I think, really sell it as something creepy and unusual and unsettling. The Ascended Fiend here Doesn't look all that different from the others. He's got a full set of arms instead of just tentacles. He has that whole bunch of tentacles on the back. He almost looks like a displacer beast, kind of. But he has a heroic rock, and so that's how you know he's at the top of that particular food chain. Now lastly, we have the Reaper Flying Beast. It has the same look as the Great Horror, but a heck of a lot bigger and with a rider. It really does just look like a larger version of the Great Horror, longer neck, wider wingspan, and so just like with the Great Horror, I think the key to making this guy look good is going to be how you paint those wings. And as we saw in the painting competitions, if you look at the winners, there are a couple that painted this, it shows the entries really, really well done. So there it is, folks. Another month gone, and OnePageRules moves steadily forward. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and until next time, keep your dice on the table.